Good morning. It's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. We start our operation today. It's been 10 years of the war, and today is day 622 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And now we will be talking about the war in Israel. We will be talking about the current situation and the possible ways out of the situation. Joining us online is Ihor Semivolos, Executive Director at the Association of Middle Eastern Studies. Good morning, Mr. Ihor. Good morning, Mr. Ihor. So let's try to discuss the situation for the time being. What's going on in Israel? What's going on in Gaza Strip today? Well, as of now, Israeli mass media and the sources from Tzahal report that Tzahal advanced into the center of Gaza Strip. That became a little bit of unexpected to them. They were thinking Hamas would resist more violently, and for the time being, talking about the city itself, it's surrounded. We have such an information about the Tzahal advances to the center of Gaza Strip. The battles are going on. The humanitarian situation is extremely difficult in the Gaza Strip itself. It's clear that around this conflict there are a lot of passions revolving. More diplomatic démarches are happening around the countries of Global South, who revoke their ambassadors from Israel, and maybe the loudest is the position of Turkey that they demonstrated, like President Erdogan during the meeting, and then there was a statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey. What's also important is a diplomatic tour of Secretary of State Antony Blinken around the countries of Global South. The main task of this tour is to support the coalition of moderate Arab countries in order not to allow Russia, China, and respectively Iran reinforce their positions in that region, and to solve the issue with Hamas. What's going to happen to Gaza Strip after Hamas? For what I know, the European Union also identified their position. No Hamas in Gaza, no blockade of Gaza Strip, and no Israel in Gaza Strip. Mr. Ihor, talking about the position of Israel, what do you think? What do they aspire to? We understand that in fact what's going on now is it safe to call it a ground operation that was massively discussed whether it's supposed or not supposed to happen, and what is the final goal of Israel in this phase? Well, you know, obviously it is a ground operation. It's obvious because the Israeli troops are in the city of Gaza itself. The question about what Israel aspires to is complicated. Lately we've heard a lot of different statements by the representatives of a ruling party of the government, one of whom was suggesting to drop a nuclear bomb over Gaza. Another one was suggesting the ethnic cleansing and fully destroy the city of Gaza, and so on and so forth. So those radicals who are pretty loud in Israeli government and Knesset today, they very seriously tarnish the image of Israel or create a wrong vision of the intentions of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu in this case acts based on the political situation. In his turn, he realizes that sooner or later he will have to bear responsibility for the failure of the 7th of October. So, in opinion of a lot of Israeli experts, he's interested in a protracted war to find different options for his political survival during this protracted war. Long war, in its turn, results in serious economic, political, and diplomatic losses for Israel, because the window of opportunities for Tel Aviv is going to close the longer the faster, and the pressure over the Israeli government is going to grow, and the Israelites will have to decide about the future. There was also information, quite important information, if we are discussing what's going to happen to Gaza after Hamas and how does it correlate with the plans of Israel. So there was information that the government of Palestinian autonomy is ready to take responsibility for the situation in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. However, given the condition, there will be a consensus solution. I mean, the solution of the situation with the Palestinian state. So I think this crisis have clearly demonstrated that the politics of Benjamin Netanyahu aimed at specifically reinforcement of Hamas as a partner that allows Israelis to justify the impossibility to create the Palestinian state. It basically crashed. What's most serious is that Israelis don't have strategy of withdrawal. Europeans, Arabs, maybe even Turkish, they have the strategy for withdrawal, but Israelis so far cannot formulate it. The last address of Netanyahu looks more as an attempt of blindfolding the statements that after destruction of Hamas, Gaza is going to flourish, and it was an address mostly for Western diplomats. So it's a reaction for a growing critics of Israel all around the world. Mr. Ihor, in your opinion, what can be the solution to this conflict, and what is the most likely option? What is the most likely variant that the situation is going to unfold? Are there going to be peacekeeping forces brought in? Are the Israelis going to withdraw? So what's going to happen next? Well, you cannot do any of that unless you achieve consent of Israel, which means Israel is going to bargain too. It means that the development of situation in Gaza can happen in any direction. Israel can occupy that territory and then subsequently annex. They can exercise ethnic cleansing of that area. But there's just a probability. I'm considering a number of probabilities that are considered by other players, something that's on the table. In the same way, Israel can suggest bringing peacekeeping contingent to this area, creation of some temporary administration for management of that area, but all those options, they are only of partial nature, because this crisis is complex. It's closely related to the politics of Netanyahu. It means that the Palestinians issue should be solved, and I think Israel is not ready for that. Specifically, the ultra-right government in office is not ready for that. Part of that government, in fact, are the people who are straight racists and ultra-right, for whom, for example, implementation of the Messiah missions is a priority. The capturing of Palestinian land is a priority. In this situation, I cannot imagine that with a government like that, any consent can be achieved. Obviously, after the end of everything, there will be new elections in Israel, maybe reformatting of political map, creation of new coalitions capable of negotiating. At least a large number of politicians, of global politicians, for example Erdogan, is not ready to talk to Netanyahu anymore at all. And I think he's not alone in this. Mr. Ihor, in your opinion, how probable is the escalation of this conflict and joining of other states in the battle operations? I think that currently Antony Blinken is doing everything in order not to allow this conflict spread, not to allow any more players to join this conflict. First of all, Iran, and the Americans exercise the politics of deterrence. I think even the laziest ones have already mentioned that the American aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, so it's all the strategy of deterrence for Iran. At the same time, we understand that we see the reaction of Hezbollah, we see the reaction of other paramilitary formations related to Iran. And let's be honest, it's not a very worry rhetoric. So for the time being, the situation is still under control, but I would like to remind you about the reaction of Jordanian King Abdullah II, who mentioned that any attempt of ethnic cleansing in Gaza will automatically mean the war proclaimed. I don't think it's just a rhetoric, it's a formulated position of the Arab countries. Mr. Ihor, let's talk about Ukraine. What does it say? What does it tell for Ukraine? We understand that the focus of attention is shifted from Ukraine and what could be other consequences of this war in Israel. Yes, the focus has shifted, and it's no wonder, because Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of the systemic conflicts of the 20th century, and it's a part of the identity of many people all around the world. So one way or another, if people ponder a little bit more than over their daily life, sooner or later they identify what they think about that conflict. This is why this commotion that we observe, those demonstrations that can quickly grow into violent ones, if the situation continues as difficult as this, obviously it takes attention from us. So talking about Ukraine, I would like to emphasize that for Ukraine, the relations with Israel and Arab countries are equally important. Ukraine was exercising the policy that contemplates two-state solution. I mean, in relation of the solution of Middle Eastern conflict, I don't think that there are any circumstances that force us to reconsider our position. At the same time, it's important for us as a country waging a war against Russia, experiencing the strikes of aviation bombs, missiles, which result in death of civil population. So it's important for us to document this position, that bombing and the death of civil population, humanitarian catastrophe, and the rest of such things are unacceptable. There should be help and support provided for civil population. People should not suffer only because of politicians starting wars. And this approach, in my opinion, is something that gives us opportunities, that enables us to explain our position when we state that terror should be fought, and fought without compromise. But no one is canceling the humanitarian law. Civilians should not suffer. Thank you, dear colleagues. Do we have any questions on the floor? Ukrinform, Ivan Kasakin. Good morning, Mr. Ihor. Well, I will allow myself to say you were criticizing the government of Israel. So after the massacre in the north of the country, when President Biden came to Israel, he called the country not to repeat the mistakes of the United States. Can you answer a question that after some time has passed, when Israel has resorted to ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza Strip, is Israel now repeating the mistakes of United States in Iraq and Afghanistan? Israelis are repeating their own mistakes because political decisions, they are not taken by the military who fight in the battlefield against Hamas terrorists. Political decisions are taken in the offices, and those who are in the offices are the people motivated by their ideas, including their messianic ideas about how things should be. And this is the huge difference between aspiration to end the war with terror and the conflict, because occupation is what creates terror. And there are huge problems about that, huge problems with the solution of this issue. Mr. Ihor, can you please try to orient us? How long can this conflict be? I'm talking about its active phase unfolding now. So in your opinion, how prolonged is this process? Well, there are different opinions. We can only rely upon the statements made by the Israeli party. And I think that we're talking about at least 3 months of battles. It's considered that the Israeli forces are going to take control over the underground tunnels and command posts in the Gaza Strip within this period of 3 months. Talking about other forecasts, I've heard like it's until the end of year 24, and I think this forecast is more of a political nature, and it just envisages the strategy of Netanyahu government's survival and survival of himself as a politician. And the last question about the local population. To what extent do we understand that the local population supports the actions of Hamas, or is it the other way around? Well, you see, when we talk about a conflict of such an intensity and profoundness, a conflict so historically long, when you have circumstances that create the identity of those people whose ancestors were ousted from certain areas, when there is a lot of propaganda, when there is daily news coming about terroristic acts, killings of Israelis, Palestinians, well, you can hardly stay sober with a cold head, so to say. So those circumstances, whether they support or they do not support Hamas, they lose its sense. So it's the answer to a question, but I'm not trying to evade the question, I would say rather yes, a significant number of people support Hamas. But definitely not all of them. If we check out the surveys that were going on before the beginning of the operation, and the positions of Hamas were weakening in the Gaza Strip because they turned out to be irresolute to solve the daily problems of the Palestinians. So probably the terroristic act was aimed to reinforce the rating. It just like you remember the fall of Putin's rating in the end of the first decade of the 21st century resulted in subsequent war against Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and so on and so forth. That was one of the factors that could provoke it. And the same applies to Israelis, because we remember what's going on and what was going on in Israel after the judicial reform and the rift in the society that happened after that. And now Netanyahu tries to put responsibility on the others for what has happened. So he is accused of that. He says of saying that it's opposition's fault that Hamas attacked Israel. So as the direct conflict unfolds, the majority of the population remains with only basic identities. So on one hand, people survive, they try to survive in this situation. On the other hand, they base their actions on who's attacking and who's defending. Well, and the last question is about the future. We understand that the United States have taken leadership and they try to settle this situation. So if they will come up with the solution about bringing peacekeeping forces in, to what extent this solution can ensure stability in the region? Well, stability in the region can only be ensured by ending this conflict. That's obvious. Because this is when the Arab countries lose their reasons not to enter into agreements with Israel. And this is the emergence of a new Middle East Shimon Peres was dreaming about for the time being, until this conflict is solved, until it's in the hot phase. It's very difficult to talk about the possibility to stabilize the situation in the Middle East for the time being. It's clear that, well, I would be happy to see the international forces there, which would ensure the security and safety of the civil population in the Gaza Strip, and which would make further occupation by Israel impossible. I would like to thank you for this broadcast, for joining us. Dear colleagues, I'm reminding you, joining us was Ihor Semivolos, the Executive Director at the Association of Middle East Studies. Our next briefing is at 12 o'clock. We will talk about this current situation in Kherson region. So stay tuned. Let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.